Thank you, Royal, for the fabulous introduction. In terms of our talk today, a lot of my focus today is less going to be on, hey, I want to tell you some stuff and this is what you have to do, and more on, let's all understand the problem together a lot better, so that once we get to the Q&A section of this talk, we can actually have a more informed, interesting conversation. So in terms of structure, I'll talk a little bit about me, who I am, stuff like that, barely. We'll talk a little bit about why we think language learning tends to be hard, really myths about language learning. A little bit about what a solution can look like, but mostly, I want to live in the problem space. I want to talk about, what are we really grappling with when it comes to learning the language and going from there. We're still dealing with audio issues. Okay, I'm going to go with that.
I think part of it's next door. I'm going to see if I can.
Okay.
You can probably remove that and just hold on.
We can just do that. That'll be good. Okay. Testing. You got better. Okay. Just going to go really low. Okay, cool. So, background. My background was very strange. I used to be a mechanical engineer, and so problem-solving background, sciencey background should be familiar to many. But I had this hobby of singing, and that turned into me becoming an opera singer for some odd reason. So for 10 years, I was pursuing a career in opera that gave me this excuse to learn a bunch of languages. Ideally, I would need to learn Italian, French, German, Russian would be helpful, Spanish would be helpful. And that gave me a weird opportunity, which is to say, when you learn a language, when you struggle through to the end of the thing, you make a bunch of mistakes along the way, and then usually you stop. You're like, cool, I love Spanish now, the end. But when you have the opportunity to try it again, then again for Italian, then suddenly now you've fixed all those mistakes and you tried it a second time, and then you try it again for German, and then you fix all those mistakes. And so there's a lot of opportunity for iteration, which for an engineering background is really, really nice. Plus the excuse, the idea of hey, if I spend a bunch of time with this, I get better at my career. Really good excuse, really good opportunity. So I learned a bunch of languages, eventually landed on 8 of them, and wrote a book about this method that I eventually landed on. That book turned into a national bestseller, and then that led to a company, and then the company was building lots of software and tools for learning languages faster, and that led to the current insanity of my life right now. You are now all a part of the current insanity. Thank you for that. Thank you. In terms of why language learning tends to be hard for people, I believe that people believe that language learning is hard, and I certainly believe that too. I spent 12 years failing to learn Russian and Hebrew. I know that thing. I left 7 years of Hebrew school with 20 words. Just sad. And we believe that ultimately it's probably because we're adults, right? It's just, obviously kids know how to learn languages really well. And we believe that because we spent 4 years in college French, and then we go to France, and we meet a 4-year-old French kid, and the 4-year-old French kid speaks way better French than we do. And it's obvious, they're 4, they can't have had more than 4 years of exposure. I spent 4 years of this thing, same. They know better French than I do. But they've had 15,000 hours of exposure, and you've had 300 in your college course. And if your college course was spent half in English, you've had 150 actually. So when you make fair comparisons between adults and children, when you take the kid who's been transplanted to Spain for 500 hours and the adult who's been transplanted to Spain for 500 hours because they have a new job, you'll find that the adult actually learns faster than the kid every time. That's what the data shows. Adults are really good at learning languages. Kids are kind of dumb. We're good at learning things. The issue is what we're really bad at is having free time. We don't have free time. And when we try to stretch a language learning process over the course of years, where we're spending, let's say, 3 hours a week, and then we spent 4 years doing this thing, then we now have 4 years worth of forgetting that we're trying to get ahead of with this 3 hours a week of remembering. Which means we need to be really efficient if we're going to succeed at this thing. We need to make sure that the things that we learn on a day-to-day basis actually stick. And so, in terms of what makes things stick, for me, there are 3 key parts of this thing. And we're going to focus most of today on the latter 2 of the parts, because the first one's kind of easy, but really important. This is ear training. This is focusing yourself on the right data set, and then repeating that data set at the right rate so you can actually remember it long term. So just getting through the ear training thing really quickly, I'll give you an example. Several years ago, I learned Hungarian to speak with my grandparents, and I get this monster. This is fényképezőgép bezőgép. It's the word for camera. If I distract you for 2 seconds with pictures of my dog, you will all have forgotten that word unless some of you are familiar with Hungarian. And that happens because fényképezőgép is composed of sounds that you've never learned how to hear. And so ear training ends up being one of your first barriers to entry, or your first tactics to get through that barrier to entry. And there's a really quick fix for it. You just have to practice telling the difference between similar sounding words. Like if you're learning Spanish, toma, toma. So if I'm like, toma, which one did I say, the D one or the T one? And then you say, cool, and whichever one you said, I say it was the T one, whether you got it right or wrong, you all just got a lot better at that particular ear training problem. You repeat that for a few hours, you'll be familiar with all the sounds of Spanish. So this is a really solvable problem, you just have to use the right tool for it. And then you're done. But if you don't have that, you're really screwed for reasons that we'll talk about a little bit later. The second chunk of this problem has to do with learning the right information. Now, I told you that finiki bezugib was the word for camera, and that was a complete waste of all of your time. Because your word camera is connected to every camera you've seen in your life. It's connected to words like shutter, and lens, and iPhone, and all of that stuff is built into camera. Whereas finiki bezugib, for all of you, is connected to nothing. Because translations, they're the least useful information about any words. And so instead of translations, I would suggest that you learn your first simple words using images. And then when you want to learn things that are more abstract, like grammar and stuff like that, then you focus on things like fill-in-the-blank sentences, like if you want to learn the preposition en estar en llamas. This is what that could look like. Again, we'll talk about why that is in a bit. The last piece is, well, when do you need to repeat this stuff so you actually remember it? Because it doesn't matter how well you build the first memory, if you never repeat it, it's going to degrade. And so the answer to that is, well, right before you forget it. That's a good time to test. But then we'll talk about how to identify that moment in a little bit. So, for me, the challenge of language learning is not about pronunciation. I mean, that ear training thing just fixes that issue. It's not about grammar. Like, yeah, grammar is complicated and interesting, but like, we're actually really good at grammar. We all learned English grammar really, really well when we were dumb and small, and we kept all those abilities as adults. That's what the data shows. We still have that ability. So grammar is not the issue. The issue is that there's this enormous data set out there that's not in here. And how on earth can I get that thing out there to stick in here fast enough, or at least long enough, so that over the time of me picking up that whole data set, it hasn't just leaked out the back end. So to try to solve that problem, let's get on the same footing. Let's all sort of sit on the same place of understanding this problem well enough. And so for that, we need to talk about, well, what are memories in the first place? When I first encountered a cookie, when I was like 3 years old, my parents probably made some cookies. They were like, hey, you want a cookie? At some point, I saw this like brown disc in front of me. And that lit up at like that stimulus of just literally seeing that brown disc. It lit up some parts of my brain just as a response to stimulus. Is that my memory of cookie? No. That's just stimulus response. And there's this psychologist from the 1950s named Donald Hebb who coined this term. Neurons that fire together, wire together. This is Hebb's law. And it basically said that when I saw that brown disc, and then I smelled the odor of cookies, well, now there's two things that are active. There's this response to visual stimulus, there's response to olfactory stimulus, and because they're both active at the same time, now they're connected. And that connection is the memory. That is the beginning of my memory of cookie. Then I eat the damn thing, and it tastes good. And so now this taste response is now networked in as well. And so now the visual of this brown disc is now connected to the taste of this thing, which is now connected to the scent of the thing. And then I feel good. And that feeling of good, like, damn, this is good, I really want one of these, is now networked in too. And now I have 4 little nodes in this little network. And at the same time, my parents are like, cookie, did you like it? Do you like the cookie? Did you want the cookie? Do you want another cookie? And so the sound of the word cookie is now also within this network. And all of these things associate together, they network together because they're all firing at the same time. That is my memory of cookie. That thing is a robust memory that will stick for a long time. And so our goal with language learning is, if we're going to be efficient about this thing, how do we make memories more like my memory of cookie and less like your memory of finiki bezuki? How do we build that thing systematically? And for me, I like to break this apart into 2 discussions. One of these discussions has to do with this like cookie-like thing, which lives in this thing called levels of processing. And the second one has to do with, well, okay, no matter how well I build that memory, how often should I repeat it? And that lives in this framework called spaced repetition. So we'll have those two sort of poles of this discussion. The levels of processing framework is where we'll start. Now, levels of processing came out of a bunch of studies done in the 1970s on college students. You'll find that a lot of these studies were in the 1970s on college students, I think because they were willing to do a lot of work for pizza, something like that, but it keeps happening, you see this happening. And so the first set of tests that they did was that they took this word bank, like really simple, concrete words. Where's the word visual? You know, bear, apple, student, pear. And they asked 4 styles of questions at random about these words. They would ask some questions that were structural. How many P's are in the word apple? How many letters are in the word bear? These are questions that are forcing you to deal with, well, how's the word spelled? These are the structural questions. Then they would ask some questions about the sound of the thing. Does bear rhyme with pear? Does apple rhyme with pear? The third category were about the concept. Does bear have legs? Does apple have legs? How furry is a bear? How furry is a pizza? And then the fourth style of question had to do with personal connections. Are you afraid of bears? Are you afraid of apples? They would do this with adjectives a lot. Are you red? Are you big? Are you sad? Something that forces you to connect this word to you. Then they would distract the students for a little while with some math exercise, and then they would ask them a surprise memory test, which was, please write down all of the words we asked you about. It doesn't matter what the questions were, just what do we ask you about? And they got this really interesting pattern, which was that when you ask someone about the structure of the word, the spelling of the thing, you pretty much always forget it. Forget most of those words. If you ask about the sound of the word, this doesn't matter how concrete the word itself is, it's just about the question, you'll remember twice as much. But still not very well. Asking about sound does not stick very well. But the moment you ask about the concept, is pizza fuzzy, furry, whatever, that kind of sticks pretty damn well. It sticks twice as well as sound, 4 times as well as structure. And when you ask about personal connections, that's the best call. It increases about 50% to 100% on some studies compared to concept. And this has enormous implications when it comes to learning a language. There's huge, huge consequences. If I tell you that this word on the left is the Japanese word for cat, you're kind of screwed. You have no structure here. You don't even have structure. You're like, this is line. Not so good. If I tell you the word on the right is the Russian word for language, you're doing a little better. You're like, okay, I guess it's kind of like, I don't know, backwards R, and then like a 3 maybe? I don't know, B-I, I guess it's a capital I after that, capital K. Like you have pieces that remind you of other pieces you know, so it's a little better, but still this is garbage. You need structure in order to remember things like this, and you don't have it here. And so you need to build that up. But even if you have structure, this is still pretty bad. I mean, if I tell you, hey, my email password is 3QH_PLY, like, please don't hack into my email, but I don't have to worry about that too much because you're gonna forget the damn thing. Structure is not memorable. You still need it, but not memorable. And so then we get into this sound area. Now we're on the second level of processing, and as we already talked about with the Feeney as you gave example, when I tell you Feeney is the word for picture, or I tell you, Moktor is the Martian word for picture, Moktor will stick better because it's composed of phonemes from English. Whereas Feeney is not going to stick as well. So we have this kind of spectrum of like how memorable is the sound part? How much can I hold on to it? And even if I can hold on to it completely, which is to say, either I have a teacher of this language that has a thick American accent, so I don't have to worry about accent, or I've actually done the work and I have my ear training part finished. You're still kind of not really on good footing. That second level of processing kind of sucks. And this is where we tend to get stuck in language courses. The moment I tell you that Moktor is the Martian word for camera, or Martian word for picture, I think I said, what you're doing is you're not thinking about, oh, picture, that's the thing I hold in my hand. That's the thing I look at. That's the thing that has imagery in it. No, you're just thinking, okay, Moktor, picture, Moktor, picture, Moktor, picture, Moktor, picture. We're trying to connect the sound of the word picture with the sound of the word Moktor. And that's what happens when you're trying to memorize translations. You're stuck at the second level of processing. And that is a crappy place to get stuck. The place you want to start moving towards are these third and fourth levels. You want to start moving towards concept. And as we've said, you're not going to automatically go there, even if the word is concrete. Bears are really concrete. If I ask about the spelling, you're not even going to think about bears. But even if I can get you to think in that third level, there's a spectrum there as well. If I tell you, my birthday's in June versus like, I have a cat, the cat is going to stick a little bit better. Abstract stuff is a little harder to remember. But mostly the trick is, well, how do I get you to think about what it is as opposed to what it sounds like or how it's spelled? And so one potential tactic could be, well, let's play with images. So no one who's looking at this image on the left is thinking, the first thing that comes to mind is not 3 letters or rhymes with bat. That image evokes this concept. And as it turns out, our memory for images is enormous and amazing. Again, 1970s college students, they did this beautiful Clockwork Orange style of study where they'd have students sitting in front of a projector like these, and they would flash an image every 2 seconds for 5 hours, 3,000 images. Then they'd ask them to come back the next day, and they'd have 2 projectors like this, and they would flash 2 images, and one of them was one they saw yesterday. And they had to mark which one was the right one, which one was the one they saw yesterday. Accuracy at that point, 98.5%. Enormous. Really, really good. They redid the study later where they tried to do it for 5 days in a row, 10,000 images. Then they tested a week later. They found even then accuracy was 83.5%. Our capacity to remember imagery is enormous and almost limitless. And that's cool, but that's kind of useless for language learning again. We're not trying to memorize images and did I see this image yesterday? We're trying to memorize words. And so the question is, well, if you pair an image with a word, does that work? Because if not, we're still screwed. And as it turns out, actually, images plus words are even more memorable than images alone, thankfully. I have this image in my book where it has a box with lines coming out of it, and it says, apples are delicious. There's no connection between those 2 things at all. But in looking at an image with words next to it, it forces you to get logic. Your brains don't like things that don't make sense. And so the moment you see this box with lines coming out, and you're like, apples are delicious. What the hell is this author thinking? I don't know, is that scent? This is a terrible image. That thought process is what gets you to ingrain that image. The search for logic there does it for you. And so any words next to any images will actually be more memorable than the images alone. So this is a trick, really. It's a trick to get you to live in the third level of processing. There is, of course, the fourth level of processing, the personal level of processing. And so in my case, if I have, my parents' cat passed away recently, but her name was Lily, and she was amazing, a giant Maine Coon, from Star Trek Discovery, these just giant poofy cats. That's Lily. If I put in Gatto and Lily and a picture of a cat, now I get to live in the fourth level of processing. Now I get to connect this concept of Gatto with this cat that I really know. And so that thing is going to really, really stick. So this is the framework that I would suggest we play with in terms of what makes things stick versus not. What makes something more like my cookie versus your finicky biscuit. The next chunk, though, comes is well, okay, I can make something that's memorable, but how do I keep it in my head next week, or in a month, or in a year? So we'll talk about spaced repetition. But first I'm going to distract you with a story. And so this story is going to be about my birthday. It's next year in 2023. We're going to have a big birthday party. It's on June 17th, 2023. You're all invited. The address will be 12843 Greenleaf Street. It's going to be in Escondido, California, 91604. You come there. It starts at 7 p.m. There's going to be a gateway with a little code. The code's going to be 4223633#. I want you to open up that gate. Past the gate, there's going to be Sergio. He's going to tell you where to park your car. He's going to ask you the password. The password's mezzanotte. He's going to say, come on in. You're going to come in through. There's going to be another gate. You're going to open the gate. The gate has another password on it, sorry. It's going to be 7778#. You open that gate, you walk up. Okay? You're going to walk up this hill. Up the hill, you're going to go around the air conditioners. You're going to go way up the hill. On the right, there's going to be a pool. On your left, there's going to be a big building. You're going to go around the building. You're going to pass a bar on your left. Go up the stairs, you're gonna turn left, you're gonna turn left, you're gonna go right into the building. There's gonna be a big old hall like this. Okay. Now, to get to this party, I'm gonna ask you to fill out your RSVP, 2 things on this thing. I'm gonna ask you, what is your favorite appetizer? I want you to think about that for a second. What is your favorite appetizer and where did you have it first? Mine is going to be gnocchi fritti. They're from Osteria Giusti. This is a restaurant that shows up in Master of None in like the 2nd season, the beginning of it. This is this Aziz Ansari like thing. So good. Like, that place is amazing. Okay, the second question I have on this particular RSVP thing is, what is your favorite dessert and where did you have it first? In my case, that was actually in Chicago. It's Girl and the Goat. They have this amazing like popcorn cake ice cream thing. It's stupid good. Just think about it for 5 seconds. What's your favorite dessert? Write that down. So anyway, so we're getting into this building. You open up the big hall. The hall has a bunch of cocktail tables. On the cocktail tables, you will find one that has your name on it and your appetizer, and 10 servings of it on a platter. And you're going to walk through from 7 to 8 p.m. You're going to walk through this giant hall, and you're going to share this with people. You're going to share it with friends or with new people. This will be the icebreaker. You get to tell people, like, where do you get this appetizer? This is the first thing we're going to do. Once that's done, 8 p.m., you're going to go down by the pool. There's going to be a bar. The bar is going to have just gin and tonic, but like you get your selection of gins. There's going to be Bombay Sapphire, Tanqueray Rangpur. There's going to be a Beefeater. You get to choose your gin, get your gin and tonic. Then you're going to go to the pool. In the pool, we're going to float around like these little pizzas from American Flatbread, which is this amazing place in Vermont and Southern California, really, really good. About 9 p.m., we're going to float out your desserts. Same concept as the cocktail tables. To share your desserts with all your friends. At 10:43, we're going to have fireworks. And then get the hell out. We're done. That's enough. So now you can kind of forget that story. It's totally
You
wrong.
have nobody at your birthday.
Just saying, it's fine. It's really expensive, so that'd be better. So let's talk about some A-B scenarios. We're going to use scenario A, scenario B. So here's one scenario. You and your friend are in a Spanish class. You have like a list of vocabulary words to learn. Let's say we're learning, animals in Spanish. There's 20 of them or something to memorize. And so this is on Monday, before the AG conference. And you don't want to do a damn thing this week. So you're not planning on studying. And so on Monday, you take about, let's say, 10 minutes to memorize this list of 20 words. And so you've gone through the list, and you can cover up one side and understand and remember the other side, and you cover the other side, remember the first side. Like, you got this thing just barely memorized. It took you about 10 minutes. You have a friend who's also going to the same conference. They've done the same test, they're the same intelligence level, they remember just as much as you do. They go through their 10 minutes, but they're actually a little bit smarter than you, because they're like, if I just study this barely, and then I do no more studying for the rest of the week, and my test is on Monday when I'm hungover from this conference, I'm not going to do well on this test. And so it took me 10 minutes to remember this thing, to memorize this thing, so I'm going to spend an additional 10 minutes doing a little more, so that I don't completely fail this test. Your friend is smarter than you, in fact, because your friend actually spent some extra time so they don't fail their test. You fail your test miserably. You get a beautiful 39%. Your friend fails it doesn't quite fail. They get a D, they get a 65%. But, kind of expected. You both did kind of shit work. Then your teacher, 3 weeks later, so this is week 4 now, after you've memorized the thing, gives you a surprise test of the same content. And so you fail this miserably again at 19%. But so does your friend. Your friend gets a 21%, which is actually within the statistical error of this particular test. And so, who really wins? Your friend spent twice as much time as you, and if the goal was long-term retention and not just getting a decent grade on this test, your friend just wasted half of their life. Your goal here, when it comes to long-term retention, should be to maximize the amount of laziness involved. You should be doing as little work as possible at all moments, because that is what efficiency actually is. So we need to get your grades above 19%, but still, this is the right road to go down. Another pair of scenarios. We're changing this out. At this point now, it's half as many words, and now it's for money. So I give you this list of words to memorize. You have 5 minutes to memorize it. It's just barely enough. And then I give you a choice. I say, for every word that you remember in a week, I will give you $50. It's on. And you have a choice. You can either have this list for 5 more minutes and keep reading through it, or you can give the list back to me, and I will give you a blank sheet of paper and a pen, and you will write down what you remember. And then you will give that sheet right back to me. Interesting choice. And what happens is odd. What happens is that if I actually test you immediately, then you having twice as much time with that piece of, with the list will give you a better set of grades. You'll get about an 80-85% on that test. Whereas if instead you got the blank sheet of paper, you're getting more like a 75%. But 2 days later, that flips. 2 days later, you having an extra 5 minutes with that piece of paper to reread it is getting you only like a 55% on your test. Whereas you getting that blank sheet of paper with nothing on it, just that pen, it's giving you closer to like a 68%. And that continues at the week mark. At the week mark, you're like a 40% if you have more time with the list, but you have about a 55% if you got that blank sheet of paper. Odd. 3 scenarios now. Scenario 1 is that I give you this list for 5 minutes, and now you can either read it for 5 more minutes. We now know that's a bad idea. You can have the blank sheet of paper. We know that's a good idea. Or I give you a blank sheet of paper, you fill out what you remember, you give it back to me. I give you a new blank sheet of paper, you fill it out, you give it back to me. I give you a new blank sheet of paper, and you fill it out and you give it back to me. The second test, first test was hard. Second test kind of easy. Third test was stupid. I mean, this is just a waste of my time. Why am I filling out, I'm just writing out shit. The results are really weird. A week later, on another study, you're getting basically a 30% if you only read it. You're getting a 40% if you take the test. And then you're getting like a 55% if you take 3 tests. Where test 2 was kind of lame and test 3 was really dumb. What is happening here? And what I would suggest is happening is that we don't tend to be told what is the action of memorizing. When someone tells us, hey, memorize this, usually we're like, I guess I should repeat it a lot. But the actual action of memorizing, the thing that gets something ingrained in your memory, is literally the act of reaching back and grabbing it from your memory. That is memorization. And so just doing it 3 times, even if the third one is kind of lame, that's you doing 3 repetitions of this strength training exercise. That is memorization. So another discussion, another thing to try to figure out is, well, what is a good repetition of this? What actually works? Is there a way to make each of these individual tests work better? And so at this point, I'm going to pick on Casey. I'm going to ask him some questions about my birthday party. Casey, can you tell me some details about this birthday party coming up?
It's in June of next year.
When? What date? Okay.
23rd.
Okay, we'll keep skipping that. Go on. Yeah, what else? Tell me more.
I know we have to go through 2 gates.
Cool, we'll stop there for a second. This thing you got immediately. You got the June part, and you got we have to go through 2 gates immediately. Because I asked you about that, if I were to ask you about my birthday next week, that's a test that worked. And immediate recall tests are still useful tests. We said that 3rd test, even though it was lame, still worked. And so you just got some benefit. You're going to remember those 2 pieces of information better next week than anything else so far. Keep going. What else can you remember?
2 gates.
2 gates.
I know we're going to walk around a building,
Yeah.
past a pool.
Yes. What was at the bottom of the stairs? You went around something before you got up to the pool.
A garbage can?
No, but we'll keep going. Okay. Yeah.
And we are going to go into a hall where
Yeah.
there's a table that's going to have a plate with 10 servings of my favorite appetizer.
Cool. What was my appetizer?
Yours was a gnocchi.
Cool. That took you about 1 to 2 seconds to get.
Yeah.
So this is slightly delayed recall, that piece. And that test, that moment of me asking you that, is actually 20% more valuable to you than your immediate recall of June. Which means that next week, that part of my appetizer was gnocchi, is actually going to be stuck in your brain better than the June bit, even though in the beginning your June bit was better than the other one. Weird. Let's keep going. Tell me more details. Tell me about the gin. What kind of gin did I have?
You had something I couldn't pronounce that you said you had Bombay Sapphire.
Yes, cool. That was like a 1 to 2 second. That was a slightly delayed recall, so we're in the same category. Yeah. What else?
I know it's gin and tonic. I
Yeah.
don't remember any of the other names.
Okay. Give me other details. What about what kind of dessert was my favorite dessert?
It was a popcorn ice cream cake thingy.
Okay, that was pretty immediate. Let's keep going. Where was it from?
Goat in the grocer.
Girl and the goat. But
Girl
no.
and the goat.
Okay. Where was my appetizer from?
Another country.
Cool. Who's the guy in the front who gets the password?
Oh, I couldn't recognize his name. Yes. So
Do you remember what the password was?
it had some sevens in it.
No, the word password.
Oh no, it was another word. I didn't.
Okay, cool. Give me more details. What time are the fireworks?
A very odd time. It was
Yeah, I
like
know.
8:53 or something.
No. Okay, cool. What time are we going to get the appetizers?
Shit, I don't know.
What I'm gunning for is something that's going to take AC 3 to 10 seconds. I'm not finding it. We either have like short things or 1 to 2 second things. If we could find something where Casey's response was like, Tanqueray. Can you get the second half? Rancour was one of them, and then the other one was a bee gin.
Bombay, not Bombay.
Beefeater.
Beefeater.
So if there was a moment you're like, what was that thing? This is a beefeater. That one is 75% more effective than the initial test. That reaching back is way more effective. And if we could get something, it's really rare to find it, but if you could get a moment where Casey's response was like, it was like beefeater. If you can get a tip of the tongue event that then leads to actual recall, that one is actually 100% better than an immediate recall test. This happens because, yes, this idea of reaching back into your memory is actually the act of memorization, but the other thing is that the moment of actually getting it feels satisfying. You get a moment of like, yes! There's struggle and then release. And that emotional thing is active at the same point as you have just activated the entire network of the memory. There were gates, it was June, there was cocktail tables, there was the bar, there was a bar by Sapphire and a Tanqueray and there was a pool over there, Beefeater. And so you've activated the entire network and an emotional response. And then head flaw kicks in. You just added an emotional bit, a really powerful emotional bit, to the entire network being active. And so that makes that test end up being twice as valuable as a test where you're just like, yeah, it was in June, I don't remember, yeah, it's fine. That's what that does. Eventually though, like, you are gonna forget some stuff. Like, you can't remember all the details of this party. And so I can give you an answer of like, hey, what was the password? In case you remember the second password. Okay, I think it was like 77777.
There were sevens. Right?
Yeah, 77778 pound. Right. Yeah. Right. And so I say this thing, and you can have one of two responses. One is like, oh yeah, and then the other one is like, yeah, okay, whatever. Like the 422363331 probably is not sticking so well. If you have the oh yeah, damn it, I thought I had that one response, then you actually just brought up the same network. You were searching for it, that same network's active, and you had another emotional reaction of, oh yeah, it's almost as good as you remembering yourself. If you get a test wrong, and then you get the feedback, and then you're like, ah, damn it, I got that one. Should have gotten that one. It's actually just about as good as you getting it yourself. If instead what you get is like, ah, okay, whatever, dude. Of course I wasn't gonna remember that number. Then you don't get the emotional aspect, but you did actually activate a lot of the network. Because you were looking around for it. You're like, okay, there was a second date. Do I remember it? I don't know, there was a guy there. It was like sevens. So you actually have a lot of little bits open when I say that the password is 77778 pound. So this is a pretty good experience as well from a learning standpoint. So adding in feedback, telling you what the right answer was after you get the test, when you get it wrong, that solves a lot of the issues of I forgot it. And so let's start putting all this stuff together. What does it look like when I want to test myself in a way that actually helps me remember things long term? And so This data set comes from earlier than the 1970s. This is from a crazy German person. This is from Hermann Ebbinghaus from the early 1900s. This guy is a nutcase, just fabulous. He sat in a room for 3 years with a metronome beating at 150 ticks a minute, with lists and lists of nonsense syllables in German. And he had them listed out, hundreds of them, on sheets of paper. And he would read them at 150 words a minute. And then he would read them again. And then he would read them again. And then he would keep doing that until he had the whole list memorized. And then he would wait an hour and then do it again and time himself the second time and see if the times are the same. And then he would do it again, waiting a day. And then he would do it again, waiting a week. And then he would do it again, waiting a month. He would keep doing it with different configurations of nonsense syllables. This is 3 years of this man's life, timing how long it took him to memorize nonsense. And what he found is that the rate with which we forget information is enormous in the first day. If he had a list that took him about 10 minutes to memorize the first time, an hour later, he lost about 40% of the memory. He retained about 60%, which meant that it took him about 4 minutes to re-memorize a list that took him 10 minutes 1 hour prior. If instead he waited a day, 24 hours, then he only retained about 40% of that memory. So it would now take him about 6 minutes to re-memorize the 10-minute list. If he waited a week, it was more like 35%. It's taking him like 6.5 minutes to re-memorize this list. If he waited a month, it's like 6 minutes to re-memorize this list. Actually 7 minutes, sorry. These things. And so the weird thing about this is that, yes, in the first day we lose so much. I mean, man, this thing's just like a sieve. You're losing everything that's coming in your front door. But there's some remnant that sticks for a very long time, years even. You get to keep about 20% of even garbage like nonsense syllables, like 10 years later. And if you take a test, and what I mean by a test is like a really good test, a test where you've waited long enough such that you've forgotten a lot of stuff. So most of your events are delayed recall events, including these like the good ones. And every time you mess up, we give you feedback. So you get that bit back. And then you keep reviewing it until you actually have the whole damn thing memorized. Then what you'll find is that the long-term loss slows down a lot. At the 10-year mark, instead of holding on to about 20% of the memory, you're holding on to about 50% of the memory. That's one test. Super impressive. And so if you combine that, you do a bunch of tests. You take one at the 4-day mark, you take one at the 1-week mark, you take one at the 3-week mark, another one at like the month-and-a-half mark. If you take 8 tests over 5 years, which is not a lot in that kind of time span, what you'll find is your long-term retention sits at about 70% for this data set, when it used to be 20% before. And so if you combine all these pieces, you say, hey, why don't I try to maximize levels of processing for something I'm learning? I'm going to take a word, I want to learn gata, female cat in Spanish, and so I'm going to pick up Lily. I'm going to be like, Lily, eres una gata, and then like pick her up and take a picture of her, like being like, why are you touching me? Like all this stuff, and you get that picture, you stick it on a flashcard, and you do that on day 0, and on day 1, you test yourself on that flashcard, and that flashcard's like, here's a picture of your cat, being like, hey, get the hell away from me. And I'm like, gata. I remember that thing. And you stick this in a computer program so it can do the scheduling for you. And so the program, and like, let's say, you tell it you get it right, and the program says, okay, let's try an interval of 4 days. Let's try to have you forget some more. So it's not an immediate recall test. And then 4 days later, it's like, hey, here's a picture of your freaked out cat. And you're like, got it. And it says, okay, you handled a 4-day interval, good job, let's try a 7-day interval. Now you're on day 12. It's like, what's this? And you're like, oh, that was a long interval. Gotcha, cool, I got a delayed recall test. More valuable, good. I struggled some, that's good. And so then it tries to push you to 20 days, and you get it. It tries to push you to then 50 days. And we're about to hit day 82 when we get the 5th repetition of gata, and in the meantime, I learned gallo, rooster, because whatever, I'm learning animals at some point. And day 82 rolls around and I'm like, ga, something. It's not gallo, I know it's not gallo. And you flip the thing and you get this, oh yeah, yes, gata. You You get your oh yeah experience, and you tell the program, I got that one wrong. And it says, okay, cool, 50 days was too long, let's try 4 days. Let's try 7 days. Let's try to push you past, so you can get past 50 days the next time around. And so, for me, what I tend to do is I tend to try to break down languages into little discrete bits like that. I'll try to learn things like grammar in the form of fill-in-the-blank sentences and just put them in little discrete bits that I can tell the program to just quiz me on. I try to make sure that each of those discrete bits has as many, lives at level 4 on levels of processing as much as possible. There's a spectrum there too. I mean, it's not just can I tack a name of a family cat on a particular thing, but can I have a deep emotional connection to this particular new word or concept or grammar rule, etc. So there's a lot we can talk about in the Q&A about how do you maximize that part. But you can actually break down languages into these discrete bits, and there's not a lot of them. For something like a French or a Spanish, and you want to get to high intermediate, early advanced, for me that's B2 or C1 on the European scale of fluency, where you can kind of have most conversations about most things. For Spanish or French, that's 4,000, 5,000 flashcards. You can learn that if you're doing 45 minutes a day in 6 months. And what you get to at the end of that thing is that you can actually think in the language, you can listen to things and understand things in the language, you can have conversations in that language. There's stuff you can do to add polish to it, to add to your comfort in terms of listening to, if what you're speaking, I would say, is not super fluent and comfortable at that point, but you can polish that as well. There's exercises for that. But you've done the main body of the work. The main body of the work was there's data out there and it's not in here, but you put it in there. Now it's there, and then the rest of the work ends up being okay, well, how do I make that more what I want it to be? I really am into anime. Can I make it so that I can watch a bunch of anime and enjoy myself? Then it becomes choose your own adventure. But for me, this is kind of a path based upon this understanding of the problem. I don't think it's the only path. I think that understanding the problem is the first step that allows us all to come up with our own paths through this thing. So at this point, I want to jump into Q&A. There's so much we can talk about here. I mean, language learning is it's how we think. It's who we are. It's also how we learn. There's a million things we can talk about. I will have one request with the Q&A, which is to please phrase your question in the form of a question rather than a statement. And knowing this audience, if the thing coming to your mind is, okay, Gabe, I have a statement, but I can rephrase that in the form of a question, that doesn't count. It does not count. We can talk statements after. I'll be at the author's table, we'll do statements all day. I'd love to talk about that thing. But let's actually have questions, because there's so much cool stuff to talk about. We don't have infinite time. Yes, please.
Hi, I think you mentioned that you speak 8 languages currently. Are you still learning different languages? Or are you just focusing on maximizing your ability in the 8 you already know?
So the question was about my current languages. Do I have 8 of them right now? Are they all current? I have 8 currently. Am I working on new ones? Am I working on maintaining the old ones, etc.? For me, right now my focus is on Japanese. I love the thing and I want it to be my best language. And also Japanese is the hardest challenge I've dealt with so far, and really, really understanding of it allows me to understand this problem space better, and that's actually why I learn languages, for me. I think there's a lot of good reasons to learn languages. Usually they have to do with communicating with people, things like that. And I'm an introvert. I like solving problems in my head, and Japanese is an awesome problem to play with. And so I let my other languages degrade over time, with the idea that when I actually get them to this level of I can think and have a conversation in that language, what I've discovered is they're actually very recoverable. There's a moment, because I'm one of these language blogger people and my business is languages, you have to have a street cred video. It's required. Where you have the video where you're I speak this, blah, 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 look at me speaking in French and all this stuff. You have to have the stupid video that shows you doing the thing. And I remember needing to record this in 2013, and I had lost my French. And French is one of my best languages. I had it at C1 fluency, all this stuff. I took the placement test, all that, and I had lost it, and I couldn't remember a damn thing in French. Because it had been a few years. And then I spent 2 weeks just binge watching 24 with Kiefer Sutherland dubbed into French. And 2 weeks later, I was dreaming in French again. And after that, I got a lot less scared of losing my stuff. Because binge watching some TV for 2 weeks is not too bitter of a pill to swallow. So right now, I let my languages degrade. For the ones that I really care about, there was a moment where it seemed like I was going to go on Shark Tank or something, and I was like, oh shit, now I really need to get all of them. And I was doing like tutoring sessions every day of the week and flipping the languages each time. Like there's ways to bring yourself back up once you get to a level of actual thinking in the language. The problem is if you don't get there, if all you're doing is just memorizing a bunch of translations, then there's nothing to recover. There's no like hole to bring back. And so I guess long answer to a thing, but yeah, for me, I kind of let them degrade, and German will always come back no matter what. French at this point is decently active, but like Japanese is my current target. Yep.
So during your birthday story, you had us visualize our favorite appetizer and favorite dessert.
Yes.
And then during your story, when those two things came up,
Mm-hmm.
I found myself paying a lot of attention to the very next facts. So after you described the appetizers floating around the floor, you mentioned the 3 types of gin.
Yes.
And after you mentioned dessert, you mentioned 10 different flavors.
Yes.
Those just solidified
Mhm.
in my mind. Is that a pattern you have seen, and does that fit in with everything we talked about, or am I just weird?
We're all just weird here. So the question was, what you found was that after all the moments of real personal connection, what are your appetizers, and oh, here we're in this hall with your appetizer, or the dessert section, that the next fact was something you recalled really well, and you're asking whether and I'm repeating this just because of audio, whether the next fact was really memorable for you, and you're wondering whether that's you being weird, or that's like the whole thing for everyone. What I would suspect is actually going on there is just attention. Attention is a big component of memory. There's a moment of like, if you're just kind of like, yeah, give whatever, just, of course I'm not gonna remember these stupid numbers you're giving me, then your attention dropping is gonna make it so you're not gonna recall very much. But the moment that you're extra active because you're like, oh my God, that's the exciting part, I love that dessert, then yeah, now you're really active, and so the next thing that comes in is very likely gonna be something you recall. So that's not you being super weird, that's just you having an attention span. Yes?
Do you believe that there is a genetic predisposition for multiple languages?
So when I hear a news story, the question was, is there a genetic disposition? Do I believe there's a genetic disposition for language learning? When I hear news stories that there are being 16-year-olds speaks 50 languages, and you're really angry at that stupid 16-year-old, and that seems totally unfair. Yes, I think sometimes there's some like freaks of nature who can remember 9,000 languages, and it's super unfair. But I think it's really overblown. I think that generally, we are all pretty much in the middle of that bell curve in terms of language learning. I don't think the deviation is that much, really. I think the differences in talent, which we see, so we all know people who are like, oh, that guy's really good at languages. Like we know those people who they come up with the 3, the 4, the 5 languages, and like it seems totally unfair. I think what that is more than a genetic disposition is someone who got lucky their first time. I think it's someone who has happening to land on more visual ways of taking the information in, happening to land more on the 3rd and 4th levels of processing rather than the 2nd and 1st. And so therefore someone who just by virtue of like what they guessed when they came into the problem, their solutions were closer to what an actual effective solution would have been. And then it worked. And the moment it works, then you feel good about it and you want to do it again. And then you pick up your second language and you've made way fewer mistakes than your first language, and suddenly you pick up a 3rd one and a 4th one, and suddenly now you're a language genius. And you're like, oh, here's a person who's gifted. But I don't think it's gifts. I think it actually is more strategies than anything else. And then you just take the 16-year-olds who have the 20 languages and just kind of throw them out. You throw them out in some dumpster somewhere. Yes.
Earl, in the beginning you started talking about language and images, and then later you talked about flashcards. So are your flashcards images along with the word written underneath it, or are they just words?
So the question was, in the beginning we were talking about images, but then I switched over to talking about flashcards. Like, what's the connection? Are my flashcards images? Like all this stuff. For me, flashcard is just a sexy way to say recall test. They happen to be an efficient way that everyone is pretty familiar with. It's unfortunate because I think a lot of people have crappy associations with flashcards. We've all been kind of traumatized by flashcards at some point. But they end up being a really effective tool for testing. But yeah, like what you put on that flashcard, you could put anything on that flashcard. And so I could just be testing myself on translations, and like that's not what I've been talking about. And so for me, the content on that flashcards is essential. Like there's really important choices about those flashcards, because if they were translations, If on that flashcard I said cat, what's the word for that? Female cat. And then on the other side I said gata. Then all I'm doing, even if I had an amazing experience the first time, I picked up my parents' cat and all this stuff, and I was like, hey, it's not gata. And like I had a native speaker who was like, no, you're saying that wrong, like fix this. Had amazing levels of processing, it's a 4th level, super awesome, and then I have this crappy flashcard with a translation on it. And every time I see that flashcard, I'm not really rehearsing this beautiful, good experience. I'm rehearsing translation in my head. I'm living out in the 2nd level of processing. And so what you need is you need enough on that flashcard to trigger the whole network. Enough on that flashcard to remind you about that bigger memory of when you first learned the word. For me, that is always images. I will never have a flashcard without images. Actually, I go between a few different formats of flashcards. Generally, it is image plus fill in the blank sentence. I like living in sentences as much as I possibly can because they give me another layer of story and content and context. No English anywhere on that flashcard, ever. And then on the back side, it's here's the thing I was missing from the fill in the blank sentence, plus the image. So I'm still grounded in the story. And then I will actually have another flashcard that I learned was actually only needed once I got into Russian. Like, I got away without this flashcard in French, where Russian is twice as hard as French, and I just kicked my ass. Which is have a flashcard that says just the word with no context whatsoever. Got that? And your job is to recall what the hell that thing is with no context clues. And for me, that pairing of both of those things, one, here's all the context, images, everything, the only thing you need to fill in is the word, plus here's the word, no context, no anything, fill in the rest. That pair allows you to build a really robust memory with all the networks that you need in it. So that's how I tend to do it. But there's like lots of options. Yes?
How valuable would a Japanese version of Sesame Street be?
Repeat the first 3 words of the question.
How valuable?
How valuable would a Japanese version of Sesame Street be? There's an interesting set of, there's studies on trying to teach kids Mandarin. You have a kid born to an American family and the parents I want them to learn Mandarin. Obviously that's a useful thing for my kid. I want to put them in front of Sesame Street in Mandarin, and that's going to help them, right? And what they find is it doesn't help them at all. Unless, and there's a really important unless, you stick a kid in front of Mandarin content when they've had no exposure to Mandarin, they will learn nothing. It's just noise. But you give them a nanny who speaks Mandarin for a while, you want actually about 30% of their time spent in the language, so a decent while. This is not an hour a week. And you have that nanny interact with the kid enough that they're you're asking questions hey, you want a cookie, you want some water, this stuff. So the kid actually grasps some of the language. And then you put them in front of Sesame Street. And suddenly they have enough context that then they get it, and now Sesame Street starts becoming this really powerful tool. It's the same for adults. You watching some sort of stuff that just looks like noise to you will not work. The idea of, if you want to learn Japanese and you decide, I'm going to put myself in front of 10,000 hours of anime, that will not work, kind of. It will kind of work, because when you do the 10,000 hours of anime, the first part where they're like, konnichiwa, you're I bet that means hello-ish, or something like that. And you pick up a tiny little bit. And now you've spent 30 minutes watching an episode, and you picked up one word of context. Well, you picked up one word of context, you picked up one thing, and then you watch your next episode, and they say something else, and you're like, Hajimemashite, and right after they met someone new, and you're like, I picked 2 things. I have two words of Japanese. And so you're building up something. It's not efficient, but you are building up a thing. We do learn from context, we learn from gestural language. The gesture stuff is actually our first language. English comes as our second for most of us in the room. And so if you have enough gestural content, if there's enough visual content to make it clear what's happening, then you will pick up a word or 2 at a time. It's just a question of, is that an efficient route through or not? And it becomes an efficient route once you kind of know about 70% of the vocabulary. And so that would be my target. When I start really learning a lot, using a lot of target language content, is when I have about 70% comprehension, or ideally 80, 90%. Yeah.
So I have 2 questions. One is, process-wise, would you start with vocabulary and only because then there's declension, conjugation, and all that other
So the first question is, do I start with vocabulary because there's all this like declension and conjugation stuff and that's all complicated? Do I just live with vocabulary first? There's sort of two routes in. Let me just tell you the efficient route in and then we can go like other ways. The route that I like to take is I like to live at level 4 as much as I possibly can. Sometimes that costs money, which is to say I need a native speaker. Because I can get some generic sentence about, the dog chases the cat, but like, how am I going to get a sentence about Norbert, my dog? I need a native speaker. And so initially I'll start with pronunciation first, period, no matter what. That one's just the ear training stuff I told you in the beginning, this toma stuff. And so I'll do that, I'll get that out of the way, I'll understand the sound system. I'll use some flashcards to remember that sound system, but like that's no negotiation there, that must happen initially. That's the first 2 to 4 weeks. Then I'm going to switch to target language vocabulary, but what I'm aiming for are topics that I care about. I'm not going to learn random professions and like articles of clothing and crap like that. I'm going to say, I want to watch Naruto. I like this anime series. Teach me ninja. What's the word for ninja? And give me the shortest sentence I can say about ninja. Naruto is a ninja. Give me that sentence. So that I can have the dumbest fill-in-the-blank sentence with a picture that I can. Naruto is blank. And okay, cool, let me get to the next sentence. He uses a ninjutsu. Like, what's the ninja tactic? How do I learn that word? And so I'll start building up a vocabulary of tiny sentences where I'm learning some declensions. Intentionally, I'm learning just a few. I'm not learning the whole series. And so once I've done that and I've built a little like foundation, I have like 300 words in Japanese that are all about anime, and they're all built in sentences that are kind of dumb, like 3-word sentences. And I've been exposed to a lot of declension and conjugation, it's not whole. I have like 30% of each picture. Then I can jump in, and I can either jump into a frequency list, which is what I usually do, which is, okay, now let's learn the top 1,000 words. And maybe get over to 4 or 5-word sentences instead of 3-word sentences. That's what I tend to do. I'll do that for a while just to kind of fill in some gaps on the vocabulary side. And then I will finally jump to grammar. Because then when I go to grammar and I'm like, hey, here's the 6 forms of this, like pomed. I've already learned 3 of them. And so now I'm just filling in gaps instead of trying to fill in a whole picture. And I'm also filling in those gaps using sentences that are personal about me, rather than these super abstract things we hit in grammar books. She is, they are, we are. We are what? Like, there's a tendency to try to jump into grammar as like, that must be the hard part of language learning, so let's start with that. Where you're doing these completely abstract things and trying to memorize stuff that your brain's just like, who cares about she is? That means nothing. Whereas once you already know a whole bunch of sentences about like, she's my mom, like he's my brother, they're my family. Then when you get to, okay, how do I say I am? I forgot, I haven't even talked about me yet. Then that grammar lesson actually makes sense. And it's grounded in stories and images and stuff that really stick, so I can live again in level 4.
Now, there are systems now that, and I'm wondering whether any of the systems, like I hear about people using
Duolingo.
different ones, do any of them use this structure of language where you use it?
So they haven't, which is why I built my company. The question was, there are systems out there, things like Duolingo and Rosetta Stone and Babbel. There's all these like packages of like, and the question was, do any of them do this? And what I found, I guess back in 2014 was like, no. So they do various parts of them. Like Babbel, I think often uses a decent amount of spaced repetition, so like solid, good. Rosetta uses a fair bit of skipping over translation, like that's good. Duolingo does really good gamification things, which is none of this, but also increases motivation, which is good. So a lot of people were doing a lot of the pieces. I built my company because I couldn't find anyone who was doing everything. And because when, like in my book, it was a lot of DIY stuff. It's like, here's a pile of apps, and here's how you do it yourself. And a lot of people were dropping off because they're like, well, I don't want to learn computer skills to learn a language. And so I built my company specifically for like, hey, my mom wants to learn Hungarian, but she's not willing to put up with the crap that's in my book in terms of do-it-yourself solutions. So I better do it for her. And so at this point now, I've built a 50-person company. It's all built on how do I make this automated, so there's not lots of steps.
So yours, you have a system that...
I do have a system, yeah. I'll leave it here because because we've all memorized Q&A. For anyone who wants to sort of jump in, I chatted with my team and we got a 50% discount for Mensans. So that's a good thing. But this will be for the, like we have an app and the app is, I would say, good. Like I'm not sad with my app, but the app is generic content. It lives at level 3 of levels of processing, because I can't know who your mom is. But this stuff is for the customized stuff. So what this basically does is you chat with a native speaker every day or once a week, and they ask you questions about your life, and they build content about you, and then they jam that in the app. That thing's fucking amazing. And that's the thing that's on that link, because that lives at level 4 no matter what. It's designed for level 4. Yeah, over there.
Well, I think you partially answered my question when you said that on your app that you have once a week discussions with the native speakers, because my question is, how do you learn the sound and rhythm of the language if you're just sitting there with your flashcards?
How do you learn the sound and the rhythm of the language when you're just sitting with your flashcards? And the native speaker, the question was like, is the native speaker thing the answer to that? And like, partially, it can be. The sound of the language portion you can absolutely do with flashcards. So what you're looking for is, one of the neat things about this particular problem, one of the reasons I like this problem, is that while it is about learning in general, like nothing I've talked about here has to do with language, really. This is just how do we hold things, period. This applies to math, this applies to science, this applies to everything. It's just how does our memory work? The neat thing about the language problem is that all of the data is formatted the same way. All languages are composed of phonemes that are arranged into words that are arranged into sentences. There's actually not a lot of operations you can do to change things. You can move words around, you can take a word and change it a little bit, you can add a new word. And like, those are all the operations available, and they're all formatted the exact same way, which means that when you build solutions, they can all kind of like, you're dealing with the same data set over and over and over again, so you can be really efficient with it. On the sound level of the language, you're talking about, well, what are the individual phonemes that form a word? And that thing you absolutely can deal with things like toma and toma. You can also do that in between words. And so some of the, these are called minimal pairs, the words that sound similar except for one phoneme that's different. You can do that in between two things. So like for instance, my cat Stan, this is my cat, his name is Stan, my cat Stan, versus my cat's Tan, because he went on a tanning bed. Those should be, they sound almost the same. My cat's Tan, my cat's Stan. But the T is different on Tan. The T has more air in it, it's plosive. You can use that actually to learn the difference between like the Korean T and the English T. And so those kinds of tiny different distinctions, you can get in between words to get those as well. And so now you're having groups of words that you're able to master also with flashcards. And then even when you're getting into like full sentences and the music of the sentence, as long as your flashcards have full sentence recordings on them, and you're willing to repeat after those things, then you can get exposure to that as well. And if you can get multiple voices on that, so that you're not always listening to the same damn voice or some mechanical voice or something like that, then you can actually get a lot of exposure even without a native speaker. The native speaker is the cherry on top. So not needed, but super valuable. Yeah?
Two-part question. As a poster child for language failure,
Yes.
I think I learned 4 languages in 8 years ago. But I have moderate intelligence and a lot of stick-to-itiveness.
Okay.
How long would it take me to learn 70%, enough German to be 70% conversant with my wife's family?
Tell me what 70% conversant with your wife's family means.
Sit at the table after dinner, know what they're talking about, and chip in interesting things about my cat Stan.
Cool. So, as the poster child for language failure, as someone who's had a lot of failures at language learning, how long will it take you to learn German to the point that you can follow along with dinner conversations with your wife's German family, and then occasionally chip in with, hey, my cat's tan is like this. For me, the level you're describing is B2 on the European scale. So the European scale goes A0, I don't know a damn thing. A1, I can kind of introduce myself. A2, B1, B2, C1, C2. C1 you can teach in college. C2 you can, if you're allowed to teach in college. I'm not saying you should, but you're allowed to. C2 is like you have a mastery of the style, of multiple styles of formal speech, like informal speech. You can give presentations about science and seem like a knowledgeable person, and you can chat at the bar and have a comfortable conversation, and at no point does someone think, okay, that person doesn't really know this language. That's C2. So like that's potentially better than some native speakers. C1 is like solid. When most people think like I am fluent in this language, most people think about C1 plus confidence. You're talking about B2. B2 is I'm at the dinner table. I don't feel very confident, but I know what everyone's talking about. And oh, haha, I know what to say here. That's B2. And you're asking about German. German for English speakers. English speakers' difficulty in languages. Difficulty in languages is not about the language itself. It's about how distant it is from the language you know. So we have a lot of data about English speakers because the U.S. government has a lot of money invested in English speakers learning languages for the military. And so there's level 1 languages, which are the Romance set. They are the easiest, except for like Esperanto, which is half of the Spanish. Then there are level 2 languages. These are things like Russian, Hebrew, Greek. These are twice as difficult as Spanish. They take 2 times as much time. It's usually a new alphabet will come in at this point. And then there's level 3 languages, which are 2 times level 2 language. These are Japanese, Mandarin, Korean, Arabic, and Wu, another version of another Chinese dialect. Those are 2 level 2s or 4 level 1s. German is level 1.5. It's one of the only ones level 1.5. So if you're giving it, let's say what? How much time per day are you putting in?
You tell me what I need to do.
Put in an hour a day. At an hour a day, you should be able to get to this B2 level pretty easily in about 6 months for Spanish and about 9 months for German.
So you're gonna give me a program, I'm gonna pay you, and in 9 months, you can tell I've done it an hour a day.
If you're doing the time, yeah.
Do you have guarantees as part of your?
I think we might have played with that actually. I don't know if we actually sent it out. Or did we not? I know that we've set up the marketing pages for that guarantee, and I don't know if we actually published them. So I think the answer is no. I think we don't have a guarantee because I think we didn't need it to do it. But yeah,
I'm your guinea pig.
do it. Let's jump here.
I wonder if the intensity of the feedback makes a difference. Like you said, it helps you remember if you struggled for something and then somebody gave you the words, you got feedback.
Yes.
And sometimes you just felt great about it, which probably helped. What if you got an M&M because you remember it? That's something else that increased the intensity of the rewards.
So the question is, what happens if you increase the intensity of, is it about the feedback of when I tell you the answer is right or wrong, or is it about literally just every time I answer something correctly, I get a prize? Either way.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that because
Sure.
I don't know what's the best for retention.
So, okay, so the question is like, is there stuff you can jam in at the end of the process when you win that will make you feel better and maybe make you retain better? I haven't seen studies on it, but I don't see why it wouldn't be true. Like one of the reasons why I like having this kind of discussion of being like, let me show you what the problem is that what we know is we know that head flaw is a real thing, and we know also that having high emotional arousal is a good thing to add into words. And so if it's the case that if you got an M&M when you got the word correctly, you would feel really good about it, then I see no reason not to believe that that would improve your memory. Now, what about the 50th M&M? Like that 50th M&M might be punishment. I mean, like, I don't want to do this damn thing, and now it's sapping your motivation. So I think actually probably if you really want to do this thing, what you're looking at is you're looking at casino stuff. You're looking at, can I get randomized rewards? Can I get things like what Duolingo does, which is randomized bonuses of saying, hey, good job, you just got a new star, kind of thing. And that kind of stuff does increase emotional arousal in a positive way, and in a way that's consistent and also improves motivation over time. And so the kind of ideas of, is gamification a good idea? Absolutely. And so I think that's where you really play with that thing.
So yes, intensity, but randomized, not every time.
That would be my guess, and make sure that it's something that you actually want, and something you want after the 50th time. Yeah.
Does working in pairs help?
Working in pair, with someone.
Yes, if you both go to the same software at the same time.
So the question is, does working in pairs with someone else help? It depends on how social you are, but I think the answer is generally yes. Generally, human connection tends to be a good motivator and allows people to keep going. One of the issues with language learning, like we talked about this idea of like adults being really good at language learning, that we are all basically really, really good at language learning. The main thing that we struggle with really is motivation. Like yes, like there's more and less efficient ways, and I've been talking about, how do you maximize efficiency? Part of that is because efficiency is good, but part of that's also because it feels good to succeed, and so that keeps up your motivation. It's the motivation that's actually the most central issue. Language learning, we fail at language learning because we stop. That's why we fail. More than anything, it's not this shit, it's because we stop. And if you're doing it with someone, you're less likely to stop. And so for me, that's bigger than almost anything else you can do. Yes?
I had a question about which language to learn.
No, great, yes.
The things that I would think are important to me in learning a new language are the number of speakers that are out there in the world, because obviously the more there are, the more exciting it will be to meet more people and have a chance to practice it. And also the ease of learning that particular language for someone who's an English learner, an English speaker.
Mm-hmm.
So I would guess that as a first foreign language, Spanish would be, Spanish has a couple hundred million speakers and it's really easy to learn. I already know Spanish, so what should be my next choice if my two criteria are ease of learning and most speakers out there for me to practice with?
Okay, first question is, can people hear that over here? Shall I repeat it?
Please do.
Okay, the question is, what should her next language be? How do you choose what language you should learn? Her criteria are number of speakers and ease of learning. Those are your two criteria, right?
Right, I'm guessing Spanish is the highest on those, but that one I already know. So I'll
And she already knows Spanish, and because it's probably the highest on those two variables, and therefore what's the next one that she should learn? My question for you is, why are those your two variables? No, that's not a challenge, that's a real question. Why are those two? Why do you like those two things? That it wasn't a, yeah.
I guess the number of speakers means that because as I travel around the world, there's much more opportunity to practice.
And do you like that? Do you like talking to these people?
What?
Do you like talking to these people? Does that make you feel really good?
I love talking to meeting new people and practicing language with them. And then the other thing, as far as the language being hard, I don't know, things like Arabic and Mandarin and Hindi just seem very intimidating.
And they seem intimidating because it feels like you'll fail, or they seem intimidating because just it seems like a long journey and you don't want to go that long?
It seems like a really long journey.
Okay, cool. So like that's a legitimate reason. But usually with these discussions of like what language should I learn, people try to optimize. And they try to optimize based on what they should do. And that is really different than like what's going to keep you going all the way to the end. The idea of learning Spanish because it's what someone else told you to do is the worst. Like sometimes I'll talk to people and they're like, I know I should learn Spanish, but like, God, I love Icelandic rock. But I know I shouldn't learn that one. I mean, no one speaks Icelandic, like whatever, it's a hard language, but like, I should just learn Spanish, right? And like, for those people, I'm like, no, learn Icelandic, what are you doing? You're enthusiastic about a language, those people are gonna like, love you, and you're gonna love them. Like, learn Icelandic. And so, I would say usually my response is like, don't learn Spanish. Like I had to be like forced into Spanish by my wife. She was like, we're getting married, you're gonna meet my family, like you better fucking learn Spanish. So I learned Spanish because I wasn't passionate about it, but I had to be. But in your case, you are passionate about talking to people. You're passionate about running into people randomly and being like, hey, I happen to speak your language, and like, I want to talk to you, which is like anathema to me. I don't like talking to people like that. And so like for me, Spanish is the wrong choice, but for you, Spanish was exactly the right choice. And so for you, probably something like French is going to be really easy to pick up because you basically learned half of it through Spanish anyway. And there's a ton of people who speak French. But like you can just jump on Wikipedia and be like, what are the next languages to learn? Who speaks the most stuff? And what's closest to what I speak? And so anyone in the romance set is going to be something that you've already saved half your time on anyway. So that's your right pick for you.
When you go to a foreign country that you've never been to before and you don't know one word,
yes.
What are a few of the words that you really should master when you get there? Like please, thank you, how much,
Okay, so when I go to a new country, what are some words that are useful right at the beginning? What are things that are really valuable? What's that? What's the word for that? That will basically do everything you need. That is my favorite thing. If someone is willing to really engage with me, and I'm like, what's this? What's this? It's why kids do it.
Learn nouns fast.
You learn nouns fast, but you also, when they say the sentence back of, das ist eine Flasche, and you're like, what's that? And they're like, das ist ein Computer. And you're like, das ist ein... Okay, cool. Now I know the first chunk, this first thing of this is a thing. And I know Flasche, and I know computer. It allows you to start picking up grammar and nouns. I think the idea of what's the blank word for blank? What's the German word? What's the word for table? No, but that question, knowing the question. It's not a German test. What's the word for "en," where you say the English word? I would say those two things together will allow you to build language really quickly. So I value them way more than thank you and please and stuff like that.
Oh, yeah, because when I go somewhere, I always learn please, thank you, and how much.
That's because you're way more polite than I
Yes.
am. This I haven't seen a bit.
Do you have any clients with partial hearing loss or compromised memory?
Do I have any clients with partial hearing loss or compromised memory? I have talked to some folks coming in being like, hey, I'm fully deaf. What do I do here? Like, do I do the ear training component? And some people with compromised hearing were asking about the ear training component. So far what I've gotten back in terms of feedback is that if there is just compromised hearing, that the ear training work is helpful, but there is a certain point you just have to say uncle. Some of these parts are just, they're in frequency ranges that you don't have. And so if this doma thing, maybe that's the thing that you just don't have. Maybe the Japanese ri versus li. Like maybe that's stuff that is actually absent from your biology. And at that point, me just quizzing you on it isn't doing you any favors, it's just pissing you off. But that said, I have had people with compromised hearing who found that these kinds of minimal pair tests allow them to pay attention to the right stuff so that they comprehend more in the future. So on that front, that would be the compromised hearing part. In terms of compromised memory or memory impairments, things like that, this is how our memories work. I think the idea of my memory works 30% worse than this, it still works this way. You still, levels of processing is the case for all humans. That's just how we filter out the world. And so it's not gonna change things, it's just gonna change your rate of recall. And so you just have to work longer. I'm getting waved at with time, and so I think I have to end the thing. But I will be out at the author's table. I'll have a pile of books, they're signed to the wrong people, so they'll be extra cheap. It'll be a weird story. But this is it for today. Thank you all. This was fun.